This constitutional reform focus also allows Australians to establish a voice for First Nations people. As supreme law that governs, all legislation must be interpreted through the Commonwealth Constitution's elements, which transforms any element of that constitution into a convention. Through this doctrine, all government must be formed, all of its councils, whether executive, legislative, or judicial. An effective constitution lays down the law in a way that reflects the values of a nation. This determines how a nation is to govern itself through civic interests, which should be the sole objective of any democracy. People who constitute nations must be able to govern themselves through active participation in their government and economic systems. Government by consent of the governed is a crucial element in freedom through non-domination. Freedom can only be exercised among nations where diminutive elements are abolished or minimized. Constitutions derive their namesake from the constitutive reality of nations as a collective of people. It is these people who determine among themselves who are partly or wholly responsible for exercising specific elements of power. For this reason, the existence of a legal constitution is one of the qualifying components of legitimacy among nations, according to the United Nations rule of law. There are core issues with the current state of the Commonwealth Constitution, which minimises certain freedoms. Each issue is related to an element of the Constitution that can be remedied through a referendum of reform. Such a referendum places decisions regarding Australian sovereignty in the hands of Australians and not a foreign power any longer. These issues pertain to sovereignty, arbitrary power, conflicted interests, freedom through non-domination, and manifestations of justice in the Constitution of Australia. Each of the following arguments scrutinises these issues in relation to Australia's access to international spheres of influence. Australia has no option other than to assertively bargain for favourable terms that enhance prosperity, wealth, and peace in the Indo-Pacific region. The argument for a constitutional basis for Australian sovereignty is not sourced from the presence of that sovereignty in the Commonwealth Constitution at all. Instead, the argument emerges from the absence of that sovereignty and the call for its establishment. The Commonwealth Constitution has no current implications for the sovereignty of Australia. At present, there is not a single constitutional principle in place that designates legal or economic structure for Australia's international relations. A small look at the evidence demonstrates that it was never the intention of the founding Federalists to establish a nation with a sovereign basis. The strongest evidence for this inward-looking focus on Commonwealth-state relations is the fact that there were no financial principles or banking principles or the regulation of such ever introduced in our Constitution by the founding Federalists. That clandestine framework was designated to ensure former colonies complied as new states and territories comprising the new dominion of the Commonwealth government. Subject obedience, power, and the absence of an Australian identity allowed British interests to override Australian ones. Indeed, the Crown's interest in Australia remains secondary to that of the UK, representing a clear conflict of interest. Such a conflict may also extend to the 32 nations abroad, which the Crown also reigns over. Beyond these issues, only a sovereign Australian people can accept and resolve the burden of crisis and torment experienced by First Nations Australians. A people systematically dominated and subjugated who have a tenuous relationship with a crown which established itself without their consent. So I'm returning briefly to the 1980s, where we got the adoption of the Australia Act, which I referred to earlier. That means that the UK Parliament can no longer make legislation for Australia. The UK Parliament used to make legislation to govern Australia up until 1980s. The eventual desuetude of the British Empire followed that decision in 1997. So the British Empire was only abolished in 1997, when the UK committed to gradually repatriating Hong Kong on the condition of financial agreements. International principles determine that resolve with First Nations is a sovereign Australian matter and no longer concerns the Crown at all. Australians who at first denied First Nations people through the false claim of terra nullius actively sought to exclude them at Federation as if they were populus nullius. No sovereign has issued a formal apology to First Nations people in Australia, and this apology will likely never be delivered. The legacy of Mentior Terra et Populus Nullius is the absence of a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution. Because of this absence, no legal treaties with First Nations Australians have ever been made. Once these incivilities have been resolved, voice, treaty, and truth, the three core demands of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, can be adopted not only as principles in Australia for what we have demanded at Uluru, but as diplomatic values in law and trade. First Nations Australians offer genuine methods of peace and agreement making at the United Nations and other global forums. With a cruel and calculated subjugation of First Nations Australians across the continent and on the backs of an abhorrent slave trade in Queensland, a strict immigration policy was formed. White Australia policy excluded all non-British and non-Irish people from emigrating to Australia. The policy would only be revised in situations of war and international human tragedy, with a steely reluctance. One example of White Australia policy's avarice is that African American service people had to seek permission to enter Australia to defend the Allied and free world from the Axis powers. Other Europeans from non-British or non-Irish heritage were slowly allowed into Australia. Other races were scrutinised and subjected to Australia's most fascist policies in its federated history. It was in 1975 that the racial discrimination legislation would overturn the last of these White Australia policies. Australians have only recently adopted multiculturalism as a national social value, and not without political challenge. The strictest immigration policies since 1975 were actually introduced by Prime Minister Howard, whose One Australia policy, actively opposed multiculturalism and reconciliation with First Nations Australians. That was the official position of the government. Howard stressed a perceived importance of the Australian government exercising selective powers in the nations from which Australians would accept immigration on humanitarian visas. Howard's One Australia policy failed to accept that culture or nation of origin does not determine the character or worth or value of a human being. Regardless of their intention, these political positions have influenced dangerous beliefs about immigration and race in a contemporary Australia. Through the legacy of One Australia policy, it becomes clear that White Australia policy is still seared into the nation's collective psyche. With Fraser Anning's maiden speech affirming white supremacy, this problem in the Australian experience has not been effectively challenged through legislative or constitutional means. And the former Senator Fraser Anning used the term final solution to immigration policy in that maiden speech, as some of you will remember.